Greetings, my friends, and welcome to the third Sunday of Easter. This is Father Larry, and we're going to take a look into the encounter between Jesus and the disciples on the road to Emmaus today. And the title of this sermon homily is The Divine Dinner with Jesus, the Holy Heartburn. So what I want to do is go ahead and just kind of read over the account of this from Luke. And so we're going to read from Luke chapter 24, starting at verse 13. The very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were taking time and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to him, "What is this conversation you are holding with each other as you walk?" As they stood still, looking sad, then one of them, named Cleophas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was to be the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this is now the third day since things have happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen even a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it to be true as the women had said, but they did not see him. And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and how slow of heart to believe that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. So as they drew near to the village to which they were going, he acted as if he were going further. But they urged him to stay, saying, "Stay with us, for it is towards evening, and the day is now spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sights. And they said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within while he talked to us about the things while on the road, while he opened up to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." And they told all what had happened to them on the road, and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. And that's the gospel of the Lord. And like I said, we're going to kind of delve into this, and the theme of this one here is Dinner with Jesus, the Holy Heartburn. So let me share a story with you. It was Sunday afternoon. Cleophas and his companion exited Jerusalem's western gate, heading towards Emmaus. Even the casual observer could tell that their discussion was intense. About 15 minutes into the journey, a man they did not recognize overtook them. "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" They just stopped and looked at him, dumbfounded. Jesus' execution was all, and really the only thing people were talking about in Jerusalem. It had been a tragic climax to a week of controversy, confrontation, and political intrigue. Perhaps climax was premature. A new twist had been emerged that morning. Jesus and his body was missing. No statement had been issued from the Sanhedrin or even the Romans. There were rumors of a resurrection. The gossip mills were running amok and running at full capacity. Cleopas said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here these days?" And the man replied, "What things?" "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet who was mighty in deed and word before God and all the people," Cleopas responded. And then he paused, clearly feeling that this very deeply, all this that had been taking place. And then he continued, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." He quickly wiped his eyes and started walking in. "Yes, and besides all this, it's now the third day since these things happened. Some of the women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find the body, they came back with a strange word, saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that Jesus was alive. And some of those who were with us rushed out to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, and they did not see him either." They walked in silence for about a minute, contemplating all that had been said. Then the strangers said the last thing they expected. "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken." Cleopas looked over at the stranger, highly confused. Then the man looked right into Cleopas's eyes and said, "Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Is this not what is written?" For the next 2 hours, this strange man walked with Cleopas and his friend as he took them through the entire scriptures and explained all the references to the Christ. And as he did, the fire of faith in their hearts that had died out on Golgotha burst back to life and burned with that familiar hope, the hope that can only be found in Jesus and the fact that Jesus was indeed the Christ. Could it be true? Was Jesus resurrected? Who was this man who so beautifully made sense of everything that had happened, and yet at first seemed totally clueless? There was something about him. The sun hung low in the sky ahead of them as they entered Emmaus. The stranger gave every indication that he planned to continue on. So the two revived disciples, almost desperately, pleaded heavily with him to stay them at least for the night, and they were overjoyed when he agreed. Now at dinner, the man took some bread. He pulled it apart, and he gave them each a piece. And as soon as the bread was in their hands, they recognized who he was. Both gasped. And then Jesus disappeared. And that brings us to today. Have you ever looked for something around your house, maybe your car keys or your glasses, only to discover after a long and frustrating search they were right there in your hand, or in your pocket, or even on your face? We do have this uncanny ability to miss the obvious sometimes. In fact, a good number of people swear by this principle when they play hide and seek with children of all ages. I mean, they often insist that the best place to hide is right next to the seeker, who simply takes off after counting and never guesses that they've been hiding there all along, right in front of them. You can imagine how the seeker feels when he finally clues into his mistake. And I wonder if that's something like the shock the two disciples felt when they finally realized who it was that they had been walking with and talking with on the road to Emmaus. Why hadn't they recognized Jesus sooner? Why did it take them so long to catch on? Now, biblical commentators have come up with a number of interesting proposals to explain this difficulty. It was the blinding brightness of the setting sun in their eyes, they suggest. Or maybe Jesus looked strikingly different after his resurrection. I wonder if it was something as simple as the fact that they weren't expecting to see Jesus walking along beside them there for 3 days after his resurrection. Let's face it, it can catch us a little off guard to run into a colleague from work walking along a path, or a classmate from high school standing in line next to us at the bank. Because we're not expecting to see them in this context, it can take our brains a minute or two to catch up with what our eyes are seeing. So I wonder, how long would it take me, or even you, to recognize that someone we last saw in a casket was sitting beside us on the bus, or in the pew, or on a train? Or maybe it wasn't that simple. As the text says, their eyes were kept from recognizing Jesus at first, and later that their eyes were opened. Maybe it was an extraordinary act of God that could well be tucked behind the passive voice here, that hidden agent who first keeps them from seeing and then allows them to see. After all, how else could we explain Jesus' quick disappearing act as soon as the two disciples finally do recognize him? So, there may not be any perfect analogies in our own experience to this particular sequence of events. Seeing, but yet not seeing. But whatever the reasons for their lack of recognition, visually speaking that is, there was also a deeper recognition issue here at play. Notice how much Jesus makes of the lack of understanding to demonstrated by Cleopas and his friends. He calls them foolish and speaks of their slowness to believe all that the prophets had spoken, all that had been passed down, from in Jewish history of what was supposed to be taking place. Perhaps they misunderstood something fundamental about the nature and the role of their Messiah. I mean, they certainly have been in good company if they found the news of the empty tomb hard to process. I mean, all the disciples felt it, and apparently, they were part of the group that was hiding in the upper room, of the 120 so people that were hiding up there right after the crucifixion. But notice too that a nice creative tension develops here as they wander down the road. It arises because, according to earlier verses written in Luke's Gospel, reports of the women had not convinced the disciples. Of course, Luke's congregations later, when hearing this story, know the resurrection has taken place. They, and we as well, comprehend a good deal more about what happened than do Cleopas and his companion, who are right there in the midst of everything that was going on. I mean, we want to tell them. We want to climb up on that stage or on that road and whisper what we know and shout it. Christ is risen. He's standing right there. I mean, even Thomas didn't want to believe it, and we discussed that last week. But of course, these two disciples are as deaf to our cries as they are blinded to the identity of their companion on the road. That is, until, boom, Christ breaks the bread. And notice what it is that finally prompts their understanding. Jesus does something as ordinary, sitting down at a meal, breaking bread with them, and then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. I mean, we've been talking about all along about dinner with Jesus. The many meals he shared with tax collectors and sinners, Pharisees and disciples alike. Sitting around a table together would have been a very familiar setting to the two who encountered Jesus along the Emmaus road. So I don't think it's all that much coincidental that this is where they should have their aha moment. It may have been the familiarity of the simple action of taking, blessing, breaking, and sharing that struck a chord deep within the men and triggered the recognition. What is it that triggers recognition in us here and now? What is it that makes us aware of Christ's presence in this place? It doesn't need to be fancy or complicated. It can be the simplest of things. A prayer, a favorite Bible verse, an old familiar song or hymn, or a splash of water on somebody's forehead, or an ordinary looking loaf of bread and a pitcher of wine sitting upon a table or an altar. Remember that Jesus has already lectured, and at some length, on the many references to himself throughout the scriptures. It wasn't that he was, trying to prove a point, or that he had presented the material. But the two disciples didn't actually clue in to who he was and what he was saying until they had sat down with him and they broke bread at the table. That's why within a lot of the liturgical churches, like Roman Catholic, my Anglican Church, some of the others, everything leads to and is focused upon and centered upon the Eucharist or Communion or Lord's Supper, however you want to call it. It's key because that's where Jesus opens up things for us. And remember that Jesus is sat down with these guys, and he just broke bread. It was no ordinary act. As we see it. But for them, it was an ordinary act to begin an ordinary meal in an ordinary house with ordinary folk, just like you and me. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal. And it was then, and only then, that they recognized their Lord. And although these two disciples don't seem to have been with the 12 at the Last Supper, Luke clearly invites his readers to reflect on that other important meal at this point in the story. The phrase, the breaking of the bread, becomes a catchword for the regular celebration of the Lord's Supper at the early church. And we even repeat that today. And as Luke's Gospel continues the story in the sequel, we see this taking place within the book of Acts, of taking and breaking. And the breaking of the bread becomes a key aspect of the early church. The good news in today's text is that in spite of their foolishness and their slowness of heart and the mistaken expectations, the two disciples who walked with Jesus from Jerusalem to Emmaus finally were enabled to recognize him. Their eyes were opened. And Luke says their hearts burned within them. As one person that I came across in preparing for this talks about, this reading from Luke, he says, Jesus transformed these two disheartened people, turning weak hearts into burning hearts, ablaze with the good news of the gospel. Another is simply, and aptly titles this, the Holy Heartburn, which I love because that's what Jesus did. He gets the hearts burning in a holy manner, in a holy way for him. So just a couple observations to kind of take a look at as we begin to wrap things up here. First, this is one of a handful of stories we find at the end of the Gospels about the resurrected Christ having something to eat. This means Jesus wasn't a ghost. This is a big deal, my friends, because it shows us that he has died, and he's come back in such a way that he was able to ingest food. The Gospel writers wanted to make it clear that the disciples hadn't seen a ghost. Jesus was back in the flesh. Let me repeat that. Jesus was back, resurrected in the flesh, in the new body that we also will inherit. And later in the same chapter in Luke's Gospel, we find him eating a piece of broiled fish. In John 21, he kind of basically hosts a barbecue on the beach. I mean, how bad can that be? I mean, I'd love to meet Jesus and have a barbecue out on the beach with him. I mean, that'd be awesome. And hearing the story of on the road to Emmaus, when they get to Emmaus, he sits down to dinner and breaks bread. That is, the disciples continue to have dinner with Jesus following his resurrection is not coincidental, but actually quite significant to the storyline. And finally, my friends, I'm intrigued by the identity of the two disciples in Luke 24. You may have been a little surprised that Jesus appears to a couple of second or third string players here. The fact that only Cleopas is mentioned by name and that he is not identified anywhere else in the Gospels has puzzled biblical readers and scholars for generations. I mean, some of the more intriguing suggestions are that Luke himself was Cleopas' companion, or that the two were a married couple, the second disciple being Cleopas is his own wife. Unfortunately, none of these proposals or ideas can even be proven from the text. What is fascinating, however, is that Jesus would appear for the first time after his resurrection, at least according to Luke, not to any of the 12 disciples, or even the women who went to the tomb, but to two of his lesser-known followers, the fringe, the outliers, which was his tradition. He didn't hang out with, the core, the power, the elite. He hung out with the fringes of society. So it's kind of encouraging, isn't it? Because it reminds us that the way of discipleship is open to each and every one of us. And as Reuben Durham puts it, it may be strange to you at first, but Christ will open your mind to understand his word. The word will be a light to your path, and his holy meal will sustain you on your journey. It will open your hearts, your ears, and your minds. Why me, you say? Well, Jesus isn't looking for supermen or superwomen or Wonder Woman. He's looking for ordinary, average people, open-hearted men and women, to receive God's gifts of grace, forgiveness, and love. And then, as he says in Matthew 28, to challenge us to pass them on to others. So, I want you to focus upon that, my friends, as you go out and about the world. Is your heart burning for Christ? Do you have that holy heartburn that causes you to want to go deeper into the scriptures to know Christ? Or are you just going along like Cleopas and the other disciple at first, eyes closed to the truth when it's standing right there before you? And I pray that you will have that holy heartburn and want to go deeper. So may God grant to each of us, simple, ordinary disciples, in some familiar moment, clarity of vision and the holy heartburn that comes from an encounter with the risen Lord. Amen. God bless, and may you be safe and well throughout this week, my friends.